Right, this quick lesson is on assumptions. Now, have you made any assumptions on your project, or do you have any assumptions on your projects? Probably do. Most projects have them. Some you need to have in there. But I like to describe assumptions as project killers because they're very, very easy to create. You can create lots yourself at the start of a project. You can ask your team to create them, and I've experienced in the past where I've had assumptions for all sorts of different areas of the project. But the problem with that is all it means is you're just stacking up problems for further down the line on your project rather than trying to close those assumptions down as quickly as possible. And this might sound a bit harsh, but I'm looking at myself as well because I've done this in the past. It's quite a lazy approach to project management because it's very, very easy to create lots and lots of assumptions. As I said, you're just creating problems further down the line. You go, I assume you'll have this, I assume you'll have that, I assume you'll do this, all those types of things when you should be asking, in some cases, the tough questions to find out if those assumptions are true or not. So I'm just going to take you through a few things to think about when it comes to creating assumptions and closing them down, and also what assumptions can turn into as well. So there's a life cycle for any assumptions you have on your project. And remember, if they're not managed correctly, assumptions can be project killers. Not all assumptions are going to absolutely ruin your project. They might just cause you some problems, but some can be so disruptive. So this is why it's really important that you put a lot of focus on the assumptions that you make on your projects. So let's go through the flow. So you might have an assumption that we assume that the client will provide us with the brand assets on X date so we can begin the design phase. Perfectly normal assumption to make at the start of a project. But then you're working on the project itself and you hear there's talk of a new brand creation project potentially starting within the client's company. Suddenly you're like, oh, this is now a risk. It's not an assumption anymore, it's actually turned into a risk. And then that brand creation project is being confirmed and it's going to change the look and feel of the client's brand. So now you've got a dependency on this project where previously it was just an assumption that you're going to get the information that you need. Then you hear that brand creation project is actually starting after the date you have to begin your design phase. So now you've got an issue. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is you have to manage your assumptions very, very carefully. Otherwise, they can turn into risks, dependencies, and issues. Sometimes there's things that are a little bit out of your control. But even in this scenario, the more conversations you have at the start about that assumption and dates, what you need, the impact of it, etc., the more in control you are of the situation. And even if that means control means, well, actually, now you're going to get more money and extension and things like that, versus an assumption that's just in a little bit of writing on page 12 of an SOW that can just get completely missed. So, what you want to do is, with any assumption that's been made, so the steps you need to take once an assumption is created, you then need to discuss it. This is just about getting an understanding of why have you made this assumption? What can we do about it? Can we answer that already? Can we just close this one down? And whatever it is, don't just take verbatim what is shared with you as a project manager when it comes to assumptions. You just add them all into the SOW or whatever it might be. Make sure you discuss them and understand them. And then you've got to think about, well, what do we need to do to be able to close this assumption down? What are the conversations we need to have? What access do I need to certain data? Whatever it is, you've got to talk about the plan and then create the actions to be able to close it down. And those actions, in some cases, might not be for weeks into the project or months into the project, but you've got to have some actions for your assumption. Even if it's, we cannot close this assumption right now, it's minus 5 days before we start the project. But on the start of month 2, we'll be in these conversations with these people, and that's when we can close this assumption down. And ultimately, that's what you want to get to. You want to close it down. Sometimes that might be in the discussion, sometimes that might be in the planning, or it might just be simply we take this action at this point, and then we can close this assumption down. And that can be pre or during the project life cycle. Ideally, you want to close as many assumptions as you can at the start of the project or before the project even starts, but you can't always do that. Sometimes it's during the project itself. Right, should go through a few key points now. So you will need some assumptions on your project. Just be careful, like I was saying at the start, just don't create too many of them, because once you have too many, then they're hard to manage and they can get forgotten about, and then they can turn into those issues like I mentioned before. If you have an assumption, just work as hard as you can to get rid of that assumption, especially before a project starts. Remember, it's lazy project management if you just stack your SOW or a contract full of assumptions, and it's just going to create problems further down the line. When a team member shares an assumption with you, don't just write it down and add it to your assumptions log or whatever you store them. Ask them why they have that assumption. You want to have a discussion, because you might be able to actually close it down in the moment. Oh, no, we do know that. We're getting it on this date, or whatever it might be. And if you have to add an assumption to a contract on SOW, always add the action for when you're going to close that assumption down as well. And like I said before, you may have, we have this assumption, we'll get this information from the client. And then in the actions, we'll be discussing it in this client review meeting on the 5th of February, whatever it is, just have something there so you can then adapt that and, well, add it to your plan. And on the plans, just make it visible when you're going to discuss and close an assumption. Remember, they can just disappear assumptions into or stay in SOWs and contracts, or they might be in a RAID log or something like that. But you want to make them as visible, as possible. So put them into your plan that you're going to close down assumption X. And sometimes you can number the assumptions as well, whatever makes most sense for you. And regularly ask yourself and the team, do we have any assumptions? Because it's not just at the start of the project assumptions are made. Assumptions are made all the time. Oh, I thought Ben was going to do that. Is the classic assumption that many people make. But if someone has assumed something, ask them why and try and close that assumption down as quickly as possible. And don't think just because you've documented assumption, if it comes true, then you're okay. You still have a problem to solve. And by that, I mean, in my background, which is a lot in the agency world, so you've got lots of clients, you feel like, oh, well, I'm covered. I've put the assumption in the contract. And if that assumption doesn't come true, then it's kind of not my problem. I've put it in there. I've assumed that's what I said. You read the contract, you signed the contract. But the problem is, if that assumption turns into an issue, you've still got to fix that issue. You've still got to work with your client to fix it. And often, most cases, issues are not nice to deal with. No one wants problems. No one wants issues. And then the client might not be very happy, or your team aren't very happy. Whatever it is, the impact is generally not good. So don't think just because you've documented it, you've done your job, that's like proper job's worth approach to it, that you're okay. You're still going to have to fix that problem and work with people. And again, nobody wants problems. And remember, final point, assumptions can quickly turn into risks, and then dependencies, and then issues. So just remember that. Always be looking at your assumptions and thinking, how can I close this assumption down? How can I get it answered? Because you just don't want it to turn into any of these three. Obviously, risks, not the end of the world, because a risk is forward thinking and then you can still mitigate it. But even so, you'd much rather just close it down as early as possible. Thank you. That's it. Assumptions. Have you got any? Have a think. Close them down. Regularly ask yourself. Put a post-it on your laptop saying, have I made any assumptions, or have the team made any assumptions? Add it into your weekly status. Don't always just ask, have you got any assumptions, anyone? Think about different questions you can ask to get that type of information out of the team as well as yourself. All right, hope you enjoyed that.